Hello, fellow travelers, and welcome to episode number 9 of The Apple and the Hero. My name is Sara Orfali, and today I would like to be your guide on the pathways of history. In a way, our entire existence is a series of pacts and treaties, from the small, almost inconsequential and childish pact of always sharing the last sweet between best friends to the happily ever after of two people in love. We sign a contract for our job or for our house, and even buying the latest technology might require us to draw up a binding document between us and the sellers. Such contracts are everywhere in our personal and public life, but they also make up the foundations of our history. There are different examples of the uses we as humans have found for these documents. We have depended on them to fix the borders between countries, from the very ancient stone block setting the boundary between two Sumerian states in the year 3100 BC, to the much more modern Treaty of Rapallo in 1920, which redefined Italy's borders after World War I. Us striving towards a peaceful existence has also been eternalized in peace treaties, like the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, which put a stop to the 30 Years' War, or the Paris Peace Treaties, signed in 1947, following the end of World War II. But the type of pacts I'm most interested in today are the pacts of alliance, two or more parties putting aside their differences to strive together towards a common goal. There have been thousands of alliances during the history of mankind, some private, some public. Some of those were very much expected and in line with previous political or economic positions between the signaries. Others, on the other hand, seem to have very much come from out the left field and had left contemporaries, and sometimes historians as well, astonished. Most of these political pacts didn't last long. The span of a war, or in some cases, just the length of one single battle. And yet, some of them lasted a long, long time, and, in one particular case, even to today. According to various historical sources, the oldest alliance which is still functioning today is the Treaty of Windsor, signed on May 9, 1386, between King Richard II of England and King John I of Portugal. In a speech in the House of Commons in October 1943, Winston Churchill described this unique friendship between these two countries as an alliance without parallel in history. Considering that the treaty has been going strong for more than 630 years, with no signs of breaking as far as I know, Churchill's words seemed pretty justified. It's time though now to talk about the topic of today's episode. We're still in Switzerland, looking for those heroes and legends that the Federal Council in the 19th century had used as a glue to keep the Confederation together. Today, rather than talking about heroes, I would like to tell you more about one particular alliance pact. To be fair, it cannot be considered an alliance between foreign powers, not in the past and definitely not today, regardless of the past and present differences between the first three signatories. On this document and its legend rests the entire country of Switzerland, and the mystique which the centuries have afforded to this small piece of parchment have given it almost the same status as a religious relic. Modernity has built for this document temples of worship and has made it so untouchable that it has been very difficult for contemporary historians to dig down enough in the mires of history to reach the historical truth, buried under layers of legends and misdirection. But dig down the historians did, separating facts from fiction, until what was left was maybe a poorer and definitely less entertaining history, but a most truthful one. In this episode, we're going to travel on this brand new path laid down by the historians only in very recent times. And much like when a new, faster road is built next to the old, winding one, we will also have the privilege of seeing the legends and the mystique as we travel on the truer path. Let's go back to the Middle Ages, when the meeting of three men in a pasture started one of the longest alliances in Europe. Welcome to the Oath of the Rütli. In this path, we will see how history and legend have been hopelessly entangled. Switzerland seems to have a higher than most ratio of legends being hailed as proven historical facts, a topic which we're going to discuss in depth in this and in the next episode. But it is by no means the only one where the legends or the supernatural have been considered mere facts of life, until history and technology prove the truth of the matter. After all, until the 19th century, most of the devastating earthquakes in Japan had been attributed to a mischievous gigantic catfish wiggling its tail, rather than the unfortunate geographical location of the Japanese islands on top of different tectonic plates. I have to admit, though, that the image of this giant catfish wiggling and jiggling and creating havoc is much more interesting than two gigantic slabs of stones moving, even if the damage is nothing to smile about. Switzerland is full of legends and myths, which have been seamlessly integrated into its history, like William Tell and Divico. This is by no means a typical Helvetic phenomenon, but in Switzerland it has reached such proportions that, unfortunately for the Swiss, most of their own history has been proven to be nothing but a legend, including the Pact of Alliance, which gave birth to the first iteration of what would become the modern Helvetic Confederation. But let's proceed with order, a little caution, and a hand firmly fisted on the thread, which will help us find the exit once more as we navigate the labyrinth which extends in front of us. Before we delve into the mires of the legends, let's anchor ourselves in history. At the beginning of the 13th century, Switzerland as we know it didn't yet exist, and the Holy Roman Empire was about to reach the apex of its territorial expansion and power under the rule of the House of Hohenstaufen. For clarity's sake, bear with me just a moment as I try and briefly explain the history of the Holy Roman Empire. Ready? Let's go. As Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne emperor in the night between the 24th and the 25th of December of the year 800, he also sowed the seeds of one of the biggest empires in European history. Unfortunately for him, Charlemagne's dream of such an empire died with him, only to be resurrected almost 200 years later when Otto I was crowned emperor by Pope John XII. Until the 12th century, such an agglomeration of territories was known as the Roman Empire, or, quite poetically in my opinion, the Universum Regnum, the whole kingdom, as opposed to the regional kingdoms. It is only when Frederick I Barbarossa came to the throne in the first half of the 12th century that the term holy was added to Roman Empire to reflect the new emperor's ambitions to conquer Italy and the papacy. In its 10 centuries of life, cut short by Napoleon Bonaparte and his army in 1806, the Holy Roman Empire had grown, changed and shifted, collecting or losing territory quite a few times during its long history. Different dynasties had sat on the throne, and all of them had discovered two things. One, that Germany, the seat of power, was quite a long way away from the periphery sometimes. Two, that the weight of such an enormous territory, with its different people, needs, customs and traditions, was too much to bear for the emperor alone. In an era in which journeys could last months and danger could come from the most unlikely corner, the emperor couldn't be everywhere at once. In order to keep the imperial machine functioning correctly, the emperor had split the territories into smaller units, each given to a noble family. This is what most of us know as the medieval pyramid. The emperor at the top, his vassals in the middle, and the people at the base. And this is it for my very brief introduction of the Holy Roman Empire. We might see more of it in the future when we'll meet Charlemagne and the Carolingians. What interests us the most right now about the Holy Roman Empire is the fact that it was split in smaller territories, because it is exactly in one of these territories that modern Swiss Confederation found its beginning. Just as we did with William Tell in the very first episode, let's travel once again to central Switzerland, in the cantons of Uri, Schwyz and Unterwalden. This territory had been given by the emperor to the Habsburg family. If the name makes you think of Austria rather than Switzerland, you're not wrong. They are the family of Empress Sissi after all. What is interesting is that their connection to Austria developed exactly because their bonds with Switzerland withered. How that happened is exactly what we're going to see in this and in the next episode. At the beginning of their history, though, the Habsburgs were just another Swiss noble family, hailing from the modern canton of Aargau, where you can still visit the ruins of their castle. As far as noble families went, they weren't particularly rich or influential, but neither were they poor and irrelevant. They were the same as just about any other noble family in the empire. What the Habsburg had in abundance, though, was ambition. Already at the end of the 12th century, Werner II of Habsburg had obtained the rights to rule over the territories where his family castle had been built, and the noble rank of count to use for himself and his descendants. That was only the beginning. Over the following century, the Habsburg territory and influence grew, until they commanded a land spanning from the Black Forest in modern-day Germany to central Switzerland. Part of those territories came from conquest, part from a series of imperial assignations, but the majority of their influence was gained through a shrewd marriage alliance policy, which, by the end of the 13th century, put them in the prime position of taking over some lands of other, failing noble houses like the Zeringers in the north of Switzerland. Why were the Habsburgs amassing land, power and influence, though? What exactly was that ambition that was fueling the family into creating a strong dominion of their own? What the Habsburg really wanted was to sit on the imperial throne. Nowadays, in a times of dwindling royal houses, it seems a given that the crown is passed from the previous monarch to their eldest child. And honestly, that was also true for most of the kingdoms in Europe in the Middle Ages, except the Holy Roman Empire. Such an agglomerate of territories spanning half of Central Europe was home to many a dynasty. They weren't just minor nobles such as marquises, barons or counts, but many dukes and princes made up the social fabric of the empire. And all of them had an equal shot of sitting on the supreme throne. In order to avoid bloody and brutal infighting between different factions which wanted to put their representative on the throne, it was decided that each new emperor would be elected by an assembly of nobles. This didn't mean that it was impossible to keep the throne in the family for more than one generation, but it also meant that different families have had the honor of being represented by an emperor in the empire's long history. Of course, the more influence a family had, the easier it was for them to create the connections necessary to achieve such a pinnacle. This was what the Habsburg were aiming for. And this is what they achieved on October 1st, 1273, when the Imperial Diet, the assembly of the nobles which decided the new emperor, chose Rudolf I of Habsburg as the imperial successor of Frederick II Hohenstaufen, the Stupor Mundi. That was quite a tough act to follow. But what has any of this to do with the birth of the old Swiss Confederation? Ever heard of the phrase, money makes the world go round? While this is a fairly new saying from the musical cabaret in the 1960s, the principle behind it has been true since antiquity. To reach the pinnacle of the Holy Roman Empire, the Habsburgs needed territory, influence and money. And the latter usually came from the taxes levied by the nobles on the people living in the territories they commanded. As Benjamin Franklin said in 1789, in this world, nothing can be said to be certain except death and taxes. As we pay our mandatory contribution to cover the costs of government nowadays, so did the people in the past. Most of the money coming from those levies went directly to the empire's coffers, while the nobles administering the territory kept a percentage for themselves. So far so good, right? With a decently sized territory, the Habsburgs should have had no problems collecting the money they needed to climb the ranks towards the imperial throne. But not all territories were created equal. Some of them had more to give, both in terms of trade and in natural resources, meaning that the noble families administering them were richer as a consequence. Unfortunately for the Habsburgs, though, the luck of the draw didn't favour them at all. In a time in which tourism hadn't yet been invented, Switzerland, especially in its central part, didn't have much to offer. The natural beauty of its tall mountains and thick forests was a hindrance to the spread of agriculture, and without fields and their produce, the inhabitants didn't have many other ways to make money. It feels quite ridiculous to say this today, with the banks being part of Switzerland's image, just as the chocolate, but Swiss people in the past were very poor. Taxes in the past weren't specifically calibrated on each household, but on the supposed yield of the territory, which meant that for the inhabitants of central Switzerland, paying the Habsburg levies meant living in abject poverty, and it wasn't even guaranteed they could pay the requested amount. Maybe another ruling family would have seen the struggle and calibrated the levies accordingly, but the Habsburgs had other concerns, and so they kept squeezing the people under their reign. Oppressed people are not happy people. A rebellion was inevitable. Maybe conscious of the fact that their small communities didn't have much military power, the Swiss decided to stage a diplomatic intervention. Bolstered by the news that the Comuni in the north of Italy had gained their independence from the Holy Roman Empire, the people of Canton Uri decided to try their own luck. In an unprecedented move, they petitioned the Holy Roman Emperor directly. Frederick II Hohenstaufen, or as his contemporaries called him, the Stupor Mundi, did indeed astonish the world when, rather than shoo away the representatives of Uri, he gave them what they wanted. With the Imperial Immediacy Decree of 1231, the emperor put the canton of Uri and its inhabitants directly under his own protection, keeping the territory within the empire, but taking it away from under the Habsburg control. Which was quite the unexpected move, considering that the Habsburgs had pledged themselves as loyal to the House of Hohenstaufen. In an even more astonishing turn of events, when 9 years later the delegation from Schwyz came to ask the same things as the delegation of Uri had in 1231, Frederick II didn't hesitate to give them the same treatment. And so, it can be argued that the story of an independent Swiss confederation is born here, from 1240, at the court of the Holy Roman Emperor. What about the Habsburgs, though? Given the importance of their self-appointed ambition, such news should have caused quite a reaction, don't you think? And yet, nothing of the sort happened. Uri and Schwyz exited the Habsburg orbit without particular consequences, except for the fact that they now could administer their own territories themselves. In 1273, Rudolf I of Habsburg was elected Holy Roman Emperor, and the family seemed to have finally obtained what they had fought so hard for. And then, so the legends say, one day, without much of an explanation, in order to preserve their freedom and defend themselves from external attacks, the Habsburg did seem the most probable candidate, the cantons of Uri and Schwyz started an alliance, offering a place to Unterwalden, a territory corresponding nowadays to the cantons of Nidwalden and Obwalden. What had happened to bring about this kind of result? Well, to be perfectly honest, we have no idea. From now on, the story will run onto two parallel tracks, the legend and the history. According to the legend, on August 1st, 1291, for reasons which have not withstood the ravages of time, the representatives of the cantons of Uri, Schwyz and Unterwalden decided to meet in a pasture, overlooking the four cantons lake, and swear undying loyalty to one another, with a promise to let each other live as freely as they pleased, but to immediately come to one another's aid if the situation required it. It was not specified, but it was heavily implied that a surprise attack by the Habsburgs was the situation they had all in mind. With a degree of literacy very much unheard for simple peasants in the Middle Ages, the three representatives signed a document in Latin, eternalizing on parchment their promise. This ceremony has been called the Oath of the Rütli, from the name of the meadow where the promise was made. And the document on which the promise was written is now proudly displayed in the aptly named Museum of the Federal Charter in Schwyz, and still widely considered the founding pillar of the Swiss Confederation. So far, the story doesn't seem that far-fetched, right? Except for the unexplained level of literacy of the Swiss peasants and the fact that a notary seemed to have been available in the middle of a cow pasture, nothing seems really amiss, right? The document exists, everybody can go see it, the parchment has been tested, and it comes from the end of the 13th century or the beginning of the 14th, which is consistent with the date of 1291. And many other later pacts confirm the first alliance between the cantons of Uri, Schwyz and Unterwalden. As far as conspiracy theories go, this one seems quite a bust, don't you think? So, why did I call this a legend? Let's go on in our investigation. Keep the thread tightly in your fists, because we're about to enter the deeper layers of the labyrinth. While today the document is available for everyone to see, in the past it wasn't always so. On the contrary, from August 2nd, 1291, the day after the pact was signed, until 1724, when it turned up quite by chance in the hands of cantonal archivist Franz Anton Frischberg, the document itself had been lost so completely that nobody even knew it existed. Which is weird, don't you think? I mean, I would understand if they'd lost it even after 20 years after it had been signed, but nobody questioned where the document had gone like 5 minutes after it was written, and this feels a little difficult to believe. Moreover, the one notary available to come write a document in a cow pasture, whose name has been accidentally lost to history just as well, must not have been good at his profession, since he's the only medieval notary I know that didn't have a copy of a document in his personal archives. So, let's get to the bottom of the story before we start coming up with the theories. For whatever reasons, the document was lost for 500 years, give or take a decade. In 1724, Frischberg was doing inventory in the Schwyz Cantonal Archive when he came across this piece of parchment. He opened it, quickly scanned it, found out that it seemed to have been written in 1291, duly wrote up an inventory entry in his book, giving it the number 1, as it was the oldest document in the collection, and put the parchment back where he had found it. Just like that. There was no eureka moment, no bells ringing out, no parades for the long-lost pillar of Switzerland having been found again. Nothing. Which, it's weird, right? Anyway, the document remained quietly ignored in the Schwyz Cantonal Archive for another 124 years. Let's quickly fast forward to the year 1847. This is the year of the last civil war in Switzerland, the Sonderbund War. It saw its beginning as 7 cantons, all predominantly Catholic and with conservative administrations, decided to secede from the still not quite formed Swiss Confederation and formed a separate alliance, the Sonderbund. After a campaign that lasted just about 3 weeks and left on the field more or less 100 dead between the two armies, the Sonderbund was defeated. General Henri Dufour was the winner, but he refused to press his advantage by military flattening the Sonderbund. Instead, it was decided to welcome the 7 unruly cantons back into the fold and create the new, modern Swiss Confederation with all of them. On the one hand, the Sonderbund cantons were happy not to have been flattened, but on the other, my guess is they weren't quite as enthusiastic to sit at the same table of the winners. After all, if they had agreed with them before, they wouldn't have felt the need to create another alliance, right? Tensions were high, and there was a risk that this newly created state would break at the first hurdle. One of the most intriguing facts of Switzerland today is that the cantons seem to have few things in common. Sometimes it's the language, sometimes it's the religion, sometimes it's one regional dish, never all 3 together. In 1848, the year in which modern Switzerland was founded, it was pretty clear that the newly elected federal government had to find something to keep the cantons together, or their history would be over before it really had begun. It's not clear who thought about it first, but here we have clearly that eureka moment we've been waiting for. If the goal was to make the cantons act like a federation, why not remind them that they were a federation since the beginning? And what better way was there than to produce a document which provided incontrovertible proof that the cantons had worked together since the end of the 13th century? If they had managed to weather more than 600 years together, then a 3 weeks war could be considered a small hiccup, right? And so, it was with this in mind that our document was taken out the oblivion it had lived in until that moment and given centre stage. The National Day was moved to the 1st of August as per the day of the document, and the Museum of the Federal Charter was built for it in 1936. And when I say it was built for the document, that's exactly what I mean. It's basically the size of a cathedral for a piece of parchment that is barely bigger than a postcard. Whatever problems the 1291 document might have had were ignored in favour of transforming it into the foundation pillar of the modern Swiss Confederation. It wasn't until a couple of decades ago that the scientific community in Switzerland decided to tackle the history of the founding document. That some things didn't add up had been clear for a while, but they had wanted to really know the entire story. What they had found was astonishing, but I'm pretty sure you've seen this coming. The document written on sheep parchment in a cow pasture overlooking the Four Cantons Lake on August the 1st, 1291, might not quite be what everybody thought it was. Shocking, right? The document was in Latin, which not only was weird, because peasants in the Middle Ages usually didn't speak Latin, let alone write it, it was very uncommon considering that all the other documents of this kind have been written in German. Moreover, there is no mention of the notary who wrote up the document, nor the place where it was written. And yes, I did mention the Rütli meadow, but really, no one would have really signed a document in the middle of a cow pasture. And then the historians realized that there aren't other copies of the 1291 Pact, which is quite impossible, since the supposed 3 copies, one for Schwyz, one for Uri, and one for Unterwalden, would have been kept in 3 different archives, and we know for a fact that nothing happened to the Uri and the Unterwalden archives. If all of these difficulties could have been explained in some ways, there was something which the historians really couldn't explain. As I've told you, the document was lost for 500 years. If this had really been the document on which the Swiss Confederation was founded, we shouldn't have had a Swiss Confederation at all. You do see where I'm going, right? We have other pacts, later alliances between Uri, Schwyz and Unterwalden and other cantons, and in all of these alliances, without fail, there's a mention of the very first document, the very first pact of alliance which had started the entire thing. How had that been possible when we know that the 1291 document was lost until 1724? Had the later pacts referenced an oral tradition, that would have been explained quite easily. But they do all talk quite clearly about a document, a physical piece of parchment signed by the 3 forest cantons. The only possible explanation which the historians were forced to come to was that the 1291 document was not, in fact, the founding document of the Confederation. Then, which is the pact that really started out the old Swiss Confederation? For the moment, the historians give this honor to the 1315 document, better known as the Peace of Brunnen. This document is written in German, as all the 3 necessary copies, which one would expect from a contract between 3 signaries, and in some other later pacts, it has been clearly references to. What is our Mystical Pact then? Is it really the one document on which everything rests, or is it nothing but a fake? Well, I can't tell you. Not because I don't want to, but because research on it has been very slow going. My personal opinion, after my own research, is that the 1291 document might be a copy of the 1315 Pact, created ad hoc in the 18th century, when it was supposedly found, for a reason which is still unclear to me. It is my own view that it doesn't really matter knowing the exact year in which the Swiss Confederation was founded, especially since there isn't much difference between the end of the 13th or the beginning of the 14th century. As I said, research has been slow going, but it's still going, so we might see a new history being born in the near future. Is it all gone then? All the mystique, the history, the legend? Are those 3 honourable men proudly wearing the colours of their own canton, or in Uri's case a horned hood to resemble a bull, nothing but fiction? Is their gesture, hand in the air with thumb and 2 fingers extended, nothing but a fabrication? Even if the Swiss Guards today swear their loyalty to the Pope in this exact same way? Maybe, but that doesn't mean they aren't real. Maybe they never existed. Maybe they never expressed their loyalty in a cow pasture where every year the president of the Confederation addresses the nation from. Whether or not these 3 men are real, whether or not they did sign that document in 1291 or in 1315, or never at all, it's clear that something has happened, or Switzerland wouldn't be a confederation to this day. And if we want to think that the story of 3 men swearing theirs and their descendants' loyalty to the newly born confederation while surrounded by cows has more character than simply signing a document in a city, then what is stopping us? Let's bear in our hearts the name of Werner Stauffacher, Arnold von Melchthal and Walter Fürst, the 3 founding fathers of Switzerland, whether they really existed or not. But what about the year 1307? I I will tell you the answer to that, what happened in that year and why it's considered the founding year of the Old Swiss Confederation as well in the next episode, in 2 weeks. For now, we've seen the beginning of the Confederation, from the acts of bravery by the people of Uri and Schwyz, which granted them their freedom from the Habsburg, to the great idea of an alliance, which is still at the basis of the governing system today. In the next episode, we'll see the Habsburg reaction and the inevitable war they brought on the Swiss heads. We'll meet the heroes fighting and sacrificing themselves for their country, and how their stories have affected the entire history of Switzerland, from the Middle Ages to today. As always, all the research and the writing for this episode has been done by me, Sara Orfali, Doctor in History. Subscribe to get the new episodes and join the community at www.theappleandthehero.com for insights and bonus stories. Goodbye for now. Safe travels.